Welcome back to Souls on Fire. I'm your host, Aaron, and I am joined today by Bob Greenaway. Bob is a author of the small book on big leadership, which we will not be talking about today. Sorry, Bob. He's also a 25-year veteran of the police force in Norris, Pennsylvania. What I'd like to talk to Bob about today is something he's very passionate, something I'm very passionate about, and that's PTSD, right? We know that a lot of, in my world, I was in the military, so a lot of my experience comes from service members. However, what many people may not understand is, in the police force and any sort of first responder capacity, you are also exposed to things that are extremely traumatic to the human experience, right? Things we're not supposed to really experience, or they can be very detrimental to our psyche. And so I wanted to bring Bob on to talk about, how we best combat PTSD, with anyone, right? So kind of the principles that are shared between military and first responder, how that develops, how that is eased, so to speak, or helped, or maybe even sometimes prevented. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Bob, I'm curious, what drove you to want to help others overcome PTSD in the first responder field?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the exposure to it myself, right? It's, there's different, there's different schools of thought on that stuff, but at the end of the day, it's real as far as the perception of how we absorb events we were exposed to, and I've seen people handle it well. I've seen people not handle it well at all. But one of the biggest things is what I've seen, and you and I have talked about this in different conversations, it's not properly addressed in any spectrum, right? And that for me is a world I know well. I worked in a place where there was a lot going on. It was very urban. And you were exposed to a lot of violent things, whether you were absorbed in them, or you were just witness to them in action, or you were witness to the aftermath, right? So I know that's a space where we, as a country, need to do a lot more improvement. So that's what brought me to wanting to plant my flag in that space and really help people move forward from that, or at least understand why they experience those things.
Sure. And to your point, there's a lot that we really don't talk about in our country, or there's kind of the stigma around either having PTSD or dealing with trauma. It's almost like we shame victims that go through things. Certainly the way our legal system is set up is not always set up in a way to help some of that when there's a crime that is committed that has to be prosecuted. But even in our psychiatric field, right? Like if my experience with the Veterans Association is, I would go twice a week and see a counselor for many, many years. So I was, going through psychobabble twice a week for years, and it didn't really seem to, I didn't feel like it was making much, if any, improvement. And in some ways I felt it was kind of making it worse, because, now I'm kind of reliving this thing twice a week. And then to ease the pain of having to relive that, I would take a whole host of medications.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was like this weird vicious cycle of just, I'm never getting out of this. Right. So, certainly that's how our I guess system is set up for folks currently. So how do you feel, right? Like, and we've talked about this extensively, but how do you feel that what different approach can we take as a society with, people who go through trauma or, whatever event? How can we start changing how we heal that?
To me, it has to do with perception. You and I have talked extensively about the book Tribes, right? Mm-hmm. And until I had read that book, I never looked at it like that. And I had been to seminars and, where they talk about the timeline of how we started to label people that have suffered traumatic events, whether it's in war or whatever, and really the big thing was shell shock. The first thing was shell shock, right? But that's all post, American Indian culture, where they celebrated the warrior, and we really did too. And I think the last time we did that was the ticker tape parade that we've all seen on Time Magazine and post World War II, right?
Yep.
That was really the last time we did that. And now there's been a shift to a labeling and almost like this person's a victim of something. I think I lost you. You're frozen.
Oh, I am.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, folks. Continuing on. Sorry for the technical difficulties. And Bob, take it away.
Yeah. So we're in a current space now, post that last really public celebrating returning warriors, to where we've taken and we label the trauma that they absorbed really in part of their duty with what they were exposed to by doing their duty, whether it was in the military, first responders. They're doing a duty, they put their hand on a Bible and they swore. Well, they're going to be exposed to those things, mostly so other people don't have to be. But the people that they return to are now being instructed to see those, maybe that anger, those nightmares. That person that has different eyes, their perspective's different, is almost broken, right? So I think that's a first place where things really need to be different. And not that we're going to talk about this, but when I think about this, I draw the parallel to suicide. We label people suicide to the point where we use the word commit, like it's a freaking crime. Not that they took their own life, they committed this thing, right? So it's this idea that, so to me, it's a very similar thing. When you label things to the point where you're insulating people, like, well, that could never happen to me. Well, the persons that are in those spaces are never going to be fully understood or fully integrated when you have that insular thought, So I think that's the place to start as far as the outside environment goes.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the that book Tribes, which anyone who is listening, I highly recommend you read this. Tribes by Sebastian Junger. One of the things he talked about was that in Israel, there is PTSD is not really a thing.
No.
Right? Because, the entire country is around whatever battle they're engaged in, right? They have this self-identity or this kind of community aspect to their nation where everyone is involved and everyone backs the warrior. So when the warrior comes home, like you said, they're celebrated. In World War II, people were celebrated. And that's not to say that no one was affected by PTSD out of World War II, because they were celebrated, but then they went home and didn't talk about things.
Right.
Right. And so, one of the fascinating things in Tribes is where, they talked about the American Indian and how the warriors were celebrated, and they had community such that they could sit there and talk about these things after the fact. In a book, Gates of Fire, oh man, I don't know who it's by. Gates of Fire, it's about the Battle of Thermopylae with the Spartans. And it's much more in depth about kind of the history leading up to that war, the Spartan warrior ethos, kind of how they're trained, all this wealth of knowledge. But they did touch on PTSD, and I forget what, their word for it was, but how after battles, the Spartan warriors would take off into the forest, right? And they would just go sit around a campfire and whatever needed to happen, which I imagine was them sitting around and crying and talking about this battle and all the fucking shit things that happened and they had to see. And, because again, it doesn't matter how mentally fortified you are, how tough you are, when you see other beings or living creatures in sometimes very bad ways, right?
Yeah.
That affects you. You can't just be like, haha, I'm too strong for that. Like, no, that does damage you can't train for, and so how you deal with that after is kind of that concept you talked about, that community. So what is your vision? How do we best do that, right? Like how can we start making that change to where we're providing either that space or that community for folks to come in and have that sense of camaraderie, so to speak, or, you know, shared experience that they could then process that better.
I think that, to kind of finish up the community part of it, we need to be better at telling people the truth as far as what, not that the person at home watching TV needs to know what it looks like if somebody steps on a mine, right? They don't need to
Sure.
know that. But what they need to know is the fact is these people, the reason these people were there, not the political motivation, but the sense of duty to these people, like the Travis Manion thing, if not me, then who, right? If I don't go, who you're going to send? Somebody else, right? So that is, to me, is sort of the beginning. And tied to that, which would reinforce this next thing, is the fact that they're, the idea that because it's not accepted in community the way it should be, there becomes that shame of talking about it, and I know that in the military and cops, it's the same way. It's almost like it's this thing of like, well, you're weak, right? Well, no, you're not, and I've had many experiences where you would be with 3 or 4 other people in a situation where like, holy fuck, like at the end of that, you're like, oh my God, I didn't know humans would do that to each other. And you
Right.
talk about it a little bit, but it's never like, okay, well, somebody withdrew you from that space and sent you somewhere to sit down and talk about it. Well, you talk about it a little bit, but it's usually like in midst of other people that weren't there, or it's the midst of the shift where there's still, the ball keeps rolling, right? Duty jobs are never over. So it's like, there's not a pause button, so to build in something that would allow, based on the person's perception of that event, for them to hit a pause button and say, hey, this did not land on me well. And I don't give a shit how you guys absorbed it, but I need to go sit down and talk about this. We've done much better in the first responder space with what they call peer counseling, but it's almost always after where the officer was involved in some type of event where it resulted in the loss of the life of another, whether it was another officer or a civilian. And that's a recognized thing, but there's a lot of things that don't necessarily meet that threshold in an official way, but in an internal way, they do. I'm not going to get into it now, but you and I, a couple of weeks ago, I shared a story about a domestic where, the father had done some grievous things. Thankfully, they survived, the mother and the son, but I had nightmares for years over that. And that was 20 minutes into the beginning of a midnight shift. And I was the supervisor. Where was I going to go? And I was the only supervisor, and at that time, it really bothered me. And, that was never properly processed until years later, because there really wasn't, at least I didn't recognize there to be a mechanism in place. So
there weren't good tools.
Yeah. Now, and if there were, they weren't advertised well, prior to starting this, when we were going to have the preamble, it's like you said, everywhere you went on military bases, complacency kills. Well, if you'd advertise, PTSD kills, or however you want to term it, like, swallowing this stuff forever kills, because it does. And
yes, it
say,
does.
by the way, this is the place to go say that. And I'm not talking about some kind of invented safe space. What I'm talking about is something where it's a legitimate conversation that people can have, to, much like you talked about, with the Spartans, right? With that, they're going off into the woods afterwards, and like, getting through whatever it is and make sure we're all good. And we'll go back to that place where everybody expects us to be that person, and they allow us to be who we have to be so they can continue on with the community that we've built, right? So I think that's paired with that community understanding, and then that opportunity to really in a timely manner, flesh through this thing, because, there's no complete making sense out of things that just defy what we believe to be human nature. But at least you can understand how you can navigate that and file that properly in your head to move past it, instead of have it regurgitate 20 years later in this bomb that goes off one night while you're, can't sleep. So I think that's the next logical step.
I completely agree with a lot of that, and took a couple notes as you were speaking. So it's interesting, right? As you were talking about how, the Spartans, as you were kind of sharing that back, the point about the nation of Israel and how the entire community is backing the war effort, so to speak.
Yeah.
If you were to look at the Spartan community, they were much the same, right? Like all the people of Sparta obviously honored and revered their warriors. They were the only men on the planet, so to speak, but they still had this area or tradition or ritual, let's say ceremony, that they did with other people who were experiencing the same thing, where they could all go share their experience and kind of get over this. But what came to mind as you were discussing how, we don't really talk about it in society much. It's not like, regardless of the circumstances, a police officer, a paramedic, or a fireman was involved in something that then resulted in the loss of life. Okay. Regardless of what that is, you can't just go openly talk about that to anyone, right?
No.
Like there are specific people that you would talk to about it. And I know my experience was if I went and talked to somebody about this, I either got judgment or excuses, right? So, if I were to be talking about my experience overseas, and even in a close circle, it would either be, hey, you shouldn't have been there. That was wrong of you. Or, there's this judgment over your actions. Or if the person, is trying to help you, they say, well, it's not your fault. It's more excuses than it is, wow, that must have been terrible.
Yeah.
How did that make you feel?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And instead it's like, well, what did you see? What happened next? And we're sitting there reliving it. This was my experience in a lot of, Western therapy or whatever it was, oh, okay, well, what happened next? And then was there a time that was most frightening? And then like, describe this to me. And it's like just reliving it constantly, as opposed to just, hey, let's look at it a different way, right? Let's go through the process of it, but more in a way of accepting that it happened, right? You can't make sense of it. How did it make you feel? What lessons can you derive from that and move forward, right? Like there's obviously things you learned in your experiences by seeing some of the bad parts of humanity, but I think you would agree that you can also look at those and say, I can make myself better and try to build something better based off of that horrible experience.
No, for sure. And I think one of the important things to take away from that is that when you're engaged in those, and I just like to call them duty jobs because it covers everything we're talking about, the people in general that do those things, they're out to give their very fucking best, right? They want a great result so badly, but they only know what they know at that time, and they only have the cards to play that were thrown at them. And you get a lot of imperfect results that are acceptable, but the ones that aren't acceptable are usually really the fucking perfect, to the point where it's like, hey, that's an issue. And sometimes talking through these things post incident in a constructive way can help. But you're absolutely right. We tried really hard, at least in the police community that I was in, to have an anonymous space for somebody to go and have a conversation. In some of those cases, these were counselors that had been police officers or firefighters or paramedics, whatever vein you were in. But in a lot of places, they weren't. They're people that just had a lot of support for that for those particular fields and they have a good understanding. And it really is like, not to sound corny, but it's like figuring out who you're going to date, right? Because you can go to somebody that somebody else thought, man, that guy kicked it through the goalpost. I was involved in that shooting, and man, I just feel great now. And you go and sit down and like, this guy doesn't get me at all. So it's like, and I think that's something that's always going to be there, but it's either, like you said, the extreme of sympathy, as if like I'm a victim. No, I'm just somebody that experienced that and I want to work through that. Or judgment on like, well, you guys should have never been there. Why'd you answer that call? Or why were you in that country? Well, that has nothing to do with the fact that we're post fact. It
Right.
happened. You know,
That ship has sailed.
yeah, that ship has sailed. That ship's gone. So, but we're still dealing with how's our mind framing that to be an acceptable thing moving forward. You know, so peer conversations are really good. One of the things that you and I talked about previously is there are peer support groups in the first responders world, but a lot of times the people that come to support you are from a different area. Maybe their perspective on work, even though it's in the same venue, is different. Maybe what they're exposed to is different, and it's helpful that they're there. But I've always been somebody that I think is, the power is always in the questions, because then we get to form our own answer. Like if I ask you a question that helps you go through something for you to answer it for yourself in a way you hadn't considered before, that question is really more is powerful because I asked it. You know, like I can inform you with answers, but at the end of the day, the way questions are formulated and what their intent is really, to me, what moves us forward. And that's back to your point on don't judge me or don't feel sorry for me. Just really ask me questions that are going to help me work through this in a cathartic way, that I come out the other side of that I understand it better, because we only see what we see. Or if somebody's like, well, did you consider this? And like, no, I didn't consider that, you know, and I think that's really powerful.
I find that is often the most powerful, you know, outside of psychedelic or ceremony or, you know, something crazy, but well, even sometimes then, right? Just a complete mind shift, because if someone's able to, you know, we all look at, we hear all these analogies of, you know, you're looking through the world through goggles, or reality is your perception, or you've got these filters, or blah, 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 blah. If someone is able to point out one of your filters to you and you're like, oh, snap, huh, wow, okay, it completely changes everything.
It does, yeah.
Right. You know, we all hear that thing about the 1 degree shift, right? Like, oh, okay, if you shift 1 degree and you're going to China, you're going to end up in Australia if you take off from, you know, wherever. Make these small changes. But those moments I find are like walking up to the pilot and saying, well, why don't we just fly over to Sydney, Australia? Right. And it's like, well, he doesn't have to, like, you don't have to bump the thing over anymore. It's like, no, you're right. I'm going to fly right there.
Yeah.
Right. And so that shifts everything. And so you mentioned something earlier I want to bring up. You said, I don't remember how you worded it, but you said, first, we have to start being honest.
Yeah.
That is now going into this concept where you talk about there are peer counseling groups available. Sometimes they're led by people who may not be close to you or even in the same field. And then kind of tying that back with, you know, the Spartan warriors and how they would go out with their fellow warriors, people they, you know, were intimately close with. They fought side by side. Why doesn't that happen in our groups or in our modern day society, right? If I were to get a group of veterans together and go sit in a room that I actually fought side by side with, why wouldn't that be as productive? And I think, to your point, it may be that, you know, we have this fear of judgment. Well, mostly judgment, right? We don't want to, there's this very macho guy kind of stigma put on men in this country where it's like, it's not okay to cry. It's, you know, don't talk about your feelings, you know, all these different things. So we go into a room and we beat our chests instead of being like, yo, that fucked me up. Like
Yeah.
that, I cried a lot over that, and then someone
Yeah.
actually listening, like, yeah, me too, like that. Oh man, that's, kind of actually talking through that. Whereas, it's the stigma of we have to maintain this ego or this facade.
No, for sure. And and that to me is where the honesty, and it's not just in this, it's in everything, right?
Oh, sure.
And one of the most powerful things, and I actually made a video I posted on Instagram this morning, ironically, about this very thing is like, you have to cast your own final vote for your opinion on your own changes, things like that. It's a daily fight for me to not give a fuck what other people think, right? So it's really important to take that and run it across the board because, and there were times, and this isn't judgment on anything, it's just to your point where there'd be something that would happen afterwards, and you'd get back to the station or whatever, and you get the guy that come in, and to me, it was always the signal that they were fucked up the most. Man, that was fucking goofy, right? And I'm like, no, there wasn't anything damn goofy about it. Like, I don't know if I'll ever forget it. So the honesty is, don't code it with something that is like pig Latin for, oh, that sucked. Just say that sucked, and then on the other side of that is don't create a narrative into, not us, but like society itself. Don't create a narrative that makes it you feel okay that you don't have to hear hard things. To me, it's the same reason why somebody will not pay attention to a kid starving down the street, but they'll send thousands of dollars overseas to those starving children. That's too close to home.
Wow.
That's too
Yeah.
close to home, man. Their house looks like mine. Their kids look like mine. Well, shit, they can't be starving. That means maybe I'm not doing something right, but I'll send that over there. Well, that's dishonest. I'm not saying those people overseas don't need that, but what I'm trying to say is we're really good at projecting it to where, well, that could never happen to me. I can't feel that way, and you can't outrun it. And the honesty is also in a thing, and we've talked about this. If you are in a group and you go and you sit down and there's people that show up, and you can just tell by the way they're talking and acting, they're in that group for whatever reason, but they haven't seen what you've seen. And you haven't heard what you heard. Maybe they didn't see or hear anything, but they found a way to latch onto something to have some kind of relevance and generate more war stories in a different space. That honesty would remove that, because every single person in the room would know, well, that isn't how any of this works. Like that commercial, that isn't how this works. That's not
Right.
how any of this works. Right. So honesty is a really big starting point. The rest of it won't matter because then you just build a new shell to hide under. It looks more transparent, but it's still a shell. Right. So that's why I talked about the honesty part of that.
I like that. You have to cast the final vote.
Yeah.
I had to write that down. So one point I wanted to make about, you had mentioned the guy that comes in and he says, boy, that was goofy. And that may seem like, well, it is. It absolutely is. It's a mechanism to
cope.
Yeah, exactly. Like the brain it's having trouble processing.
Yeah.
Right. That may have been that kid's first call where he saw some real shit.
For sure. Yeah.
And so I bring this up because I remember I actually unknowingly did this. Like I had oh man, I feel so bad. After I got home, I'd seen some things and it messed me up really bad, such that my brain had developed this habit of anything traumatic or anything emotionally painful, I would laugh.
Yeah.
I mean, but like, it was the funniest joke someone just told me. And I got promoted. I poured all my energy into work. I was working 40 to 80 hours a week, sometimes, just like, that's what I did. That's what I really did to cope, was I became a work addict. And I effectively rose pretty quickly and I became like a manager. My talent took me places my character couldn't keep me. But I remember this one day, one of my employees, and I was friendly, to everyone, walk around, tell jokes, haha. And this one gal, she was feeling very down. And, I was like, hey, how's it going? What's going on? And she's like, well, my son just got in a car accident and we're not sure if he's going to make it. And I mean, I laughed so hard. And it was like immediately when I stopped, I was like, oh my God, I don't know why I did that. Like, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
And I, that week I talked to one of my counselors about it. And it's like, that's totally a defense mechanism. Like sometimes the
Yeah.
brain it doesn't even want to look at it.
Didn't want to go there. Yeah.
Yes. Nope. Not dealing with that bullshit today. We're
No.
laughing this off. Right. So, I find it valuable to, so you're in that situation and you see this and, someone says like, oh, they laugh it off. I think that's a good trigger point. Like you talked about, they're not processing that in a
Right.
healthy way.
No.
Right. So interesting. So in your experience, let's say, right, you go out, go on a call, something happens, people are exposed to something, duty jobs, right? What do you think? Like after that happens, you get back to whatever's taken care of, you get back to the headquarters. What would you propose, right? So just, playing a thought experiment here. How should that be handled differently from the moment you guys roll into the station?
I think that there needs to be some type of systematic debriefing for the people that were involved. And that's a function of leadership. And it can be an indigenous leader, right? It can be somebody that, because you can be the best at leading certain ways, but there can be, like my weakness as far as emergency calls, as far as, processing the trauma, involved children and babies, right?
Yep.
Some people that might not bother them, not that it won't bother them, but they'd be much more functional leading a conversation on, let's work through this and understand, number one, who's to blame, right? We couldn't fix this thing. And we went there and we employed all these things. Do you agree that this is what we've been taught and it's worked before? It just didn't work this time. Well, if I'm not the guy that's collected enough, even though I might have the bars or the stripes, flatten it out and let the person who like, hey, I got this. I know Bob or I know Aaron, like this hits them a different way. I'll lead the conversation, and you need to do it right away. Right. And I've heard different things, but the problem with that is just the nature of, and I'll just talk about police work. Bad shit usually happens when it's dark, or it's going to be dark. Right. And why that's relevant is because it's either the middle or the end of your or beginning of your shift. Either way, a lot of things from, the primacy and the recency thing of how you perceive stuff are going to happen in between. And then you're going to go home alone, and you can go home to your wife or your partner, whoever's there. You're a young kid and you still live with your parents. You're not going to tell them.
Right.
Because that's your protection. So then you're going to go to bed and you're going to process this shit on your own. Yep. And then maybe you're off 2 days, or maybe you're going to the beach, right? And you're on vacation. Well, you force yourself to just say, hey, that's how the chips fall, cookie crumbles or whatever. Then you go back to work, and by then nobody else is talking about it because new fucked up stuff happened, right? Because the wheel just keeps spinning. So if you don't nail it then in a way where it's a proper debriefing, and we would try that, but sometimes it wouldn't, there wouldn't be time, because you would just roll from one thing to the next. And by the time it's over, nobody has the mental energy, even though they should, to even talk about the most screwed up thing that happened out of the 9 things you endured, right? So making that a process where it's a true process, it's completely expected, it's accounted for, and it's like anything else, make that what you do. And if you violate that, there's consequences. It's a protective consequence, right? And we suck at humans of wanting to have hard conversations. We just don't like it.
Right.
And, that's another way to build up, to be galvanized a little bit against it, because it's going to happen. But to know that, yeah, I'm going to get through this thing. This is screwed up, but we're going to sort this thing out on the back end. Once we all make it out of here, we're going to sort this out on the back end. So, the other part of that and the trickle down effect is then you're not as likely to go home and drink yourself to sleep, right?
Right.
Or drink a bottle of NyQuil, right? Like, it's like that in itself, that action kind of will take a lot away from the symptoms we see, from not addressing the initial cause. So I think that's a big thing, a systematic debriefing. And there's a lot of logistics. Having been in a command position for a really long time, there are logistics of how do you pull that off of there's
Sure.
6 people there and you have 12 people working. Well,
Right.
you gotta
Bring in an
figure it
entire another
out.
police force to
Yeah,
talk
you
through
gotta
what
you
just
gotta
happened.
figure it out, right? And
Right.
so that I think that's another big thing, is if it was just built in that there's a real-time debriefing about real things led by the most qualified person in the room at that point, as far as the way they were able to lead that conversation, I think is a big thing. I think that's a big thing. And I know we mimic that with that peer support, but to my point is, well, if the guy's available, the guy or gal on the peer support team's available and they're in a neighboring thing, maybe they've never been to something like that. So they can come in and they can ask questions and they can be trained. But unless they're asking the whole group, right, you're still missing that part where we healed over that together because we endured it together. And
Mhm.
that's, to me, is a huge thing. You have your own healing thing, but there's a lot of confidence in being able to be truthful about something when you understand everybody else thought it was fucked up too.
Yep.
And instead of going home, am I a pussy? Like, why did this bother me? Well, it bothered everybody else too. We just never talked about it. We went home and went on vacation.
Right.
Now we come back. We don't bring it up again because 14 other dumb things happened, right? So.
Or there's this idea that you can't let it bother you, right?
Right. Yeah.
I remember that coming home, it was like, nobody in my platoon or company, like, it's not like they didn't see the things I saw.
Yeah.
But we were more celebrating ourselves as heroes and beating our chests than we were like, hey, we should talk about what just happened. It was more rah screaming. And so that certainly didn't help.
No.
But to your point of, so you said this earlier, right? Love that. If not me, then who?
Yeah.
And so if I, from an outsider's perspective, there's a few things that obviously we could improve, right? So the concept of police work, or any military, anything, right, where there's post-traumatic stress, we need to have a supportive community. That is probably the most important aspect, is the community has to support that. Now, in our current cultural makeup, just the way things are going with how many people are being divided on either side, and law enforcement is a big deal right now, so it's not necessarily something that is supported. But the if not me, then who? I was watching this YouTube video the other day, and it was basically just a bunch of quotes from different Spartans or about the Spartans. And I don't remember where this came from, but it was an elderly man who was attending some games, gladiator thing, something. He was looking for a seat, and all the Greeks, just kind of laughed at him as he was hobbling by. And then he approached a section where the Spartan young and old men were all sitting, and all of them stood up to offer him their seat. Yes. And he said, it's amazing that every Greek knows what's right, but only the Spartan men do it. Right. And so there's this concept of, and I've really been trying to push myself and kind of embody this, was that you have to, if you are able, you have to be the one that stands up, right? Yeah. Like, if not me, then who? Yeah. Right. And so if you're the most senior police, even if you're not the most senior police guy, screw seniority. If you're the guy in there that's seen some shit go down, and then more shit happens to go down, and you can help lead that conversation, step up, right? Yeah. Go talk to your fellow officers, go talk to your fellow firemen, go talk to, whatever role you're in. If you have the capacity to start that conversation and help others process that, so, you don't have to worry about them disappearing for a week because they fell into a bottle, step up, right? Like
Yeah.
have those conversations that, hey man, I know that was fucked up. Like I get it. Do you want to talk about it? Do you want, like, I can just totally listen, man. How'd that make you feel? You're, oh man, no, that was not right. That really sucks. Like, yeah, I know, and then you're going to have to cry and hold each other, and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But be that example, be that Spartan.
Yeah.
Right. That not only knows what's right, but does it.
And to your point on that, like one of the things that's the missing piece of not what you said, but of the thing where you're not allowed for it to matter is the fact that, like you said, there has to be a space where you acknowledge the fact that everybody feels this way differently. But if I care about you as a leader, if we all talk about it together, I know that you're going to be able to heal better on your own. If I act like you should just swallow this thing you've never seen before, right? Because it's difficult for me to talk about it, well, then I can't call myself a leader. It doesn't matter how festooned my uniform is with shiny shit or ribbons. I'm not a leader if I don't do that.
Right.
I'm just not, and I'm a really, really, really big proponent that you have to care to lead. You can't say I lead and I don't care. That's called a boss, right? So this is just another example that you have to create space to have a conversation. And weren't always good at that. But one of the things that I tried to do, and I felt really good about a lot of the other leaders in my police department, was they knew their people. They're really good at leading people from where they were. So if you go on a call and there's something happens unfortunate to infants, and I know that there's a new father or mother that works with me, I'm going to pay real close attention to them. And I'm going to go to them and say, do you want to talk about that? Is that something that, you might not want to talk to me about it, but I want you to be okay with that and understand that. Right. And some people some of the old school guys would be like, well, go home and hug your kids. That's great. But it doesn't make me unsee or feel what I felt. Yeah, right. It's good. I'm going to do that without you saying that, because I'm glad my kids are hearing that wasn't their kids. But then,
without processing that, like, now you have this unnatural fear about your kids.
I'm just glad it wasn't my kids.
Yep. Yes.
So now that's a whole other thing that needs to be talked about in those onion layers in a conversation in real time as shortly as possible after it happened. Yep. And I just think that would go a really long way into helping how we perceive post-action, individually.
So it's interesting, right? I don't want to, let's say I'm a new officer on your crew. Something happens, and to your point about you may not want to talk to me, but if you do, let me know. I just wanted to share for anyone who is watching or feels called to do that. I guess the best way to approach that, in my experience, is just by sharing your shit.
Yeah.
Like, hey man, I went through something very similar where, I was on this call, dude, this happened. I mean, I was terrified. I'm pretty sure I peed myself. Then I had to respond this way. Some crazier stuff happened and I was scared. I know what it's like. That happened, dude. I was messed up for a while.
Yeah.
Like, it took me, then I start drinking, then I start doing this, and then and now that person's like, oh, damn, like I could totally see how I'd start going down that path, because man, that's jacked up. And what I just witnessed, like, you can't make sense of it.
No.
Just by, people, that's why I say the screw seniority.
Yeah.
Get the other officers and people who have been through something similar to just, hey, all right, guys, like that was jacked up. Right. Yeah. Like that's very similar to maybe this or that. Let's talk about this. Let's just, get it all out there. No judgment, no excuses, just what happened. How did it make you feel? You're right. That wasn't right. Let's cry it out for a while. Right.
Yeah. And it's super important because the wounds you don't see that you carry after you leave the job are a lot of times the ones that kill you.
The ones that do the most damage.
Yeah, they do the most damage, and I've shared stories with you before about people that I know that I feel certain that that's what took them so quickly after they retired, and I just feel like that again, that has to be something that's acknowledged. And there's a lot of people out there that have seminars, there's books on, survival, emotional survival of law enforcement, you know. And I can't remember off the top of his name. His first name's Kevin. But he was a police officer for years, and he teaches that, and he teaches at the last one I attended was for command executives, and it was really good because it was twisted towards, you need to acknowledge this, you need to see what's going on, you need to give these people space for that, right? And that is something that, if we're interested in longevity and the retention, there's a lot of people right now, for a lot of reasons, prematurely leaving police work, and you'll see them go into real estate. I know a fellow that, I want to say that he was a cop for like 12 years, and he left to become a financial advisor, and he specializes in, for first responders, helping them set up their finances, and I think a big part of that is the juice no longer becomes worth the squeeze when it comes to the way that stuff's absorbed. We all have our limits on how far we think duty's supposed to go. And if it comes to the point where I'm not processing it properly, and it's affecting my home life, it's affecting everything, that the reason I went and did those things to begin with, well, then I'm either going to not have the courage to change, and I'm going to use that word courage because that's what it is, or I'm going to leave and go do something else. And now I'm probably an asset that is no longer there. And now we have to start over again to fill that space. So It's not just about the individual officer, the individual department. It's about an entire community. Every time somebody leaves that space, before they're done what their full, I'll use the word obligation, or their full capabilities were, it's a loss to the community in most cases, so it's a much bigger picture than just the individual pieces. So that's why administrators and then, politicians who govern these places need to see that, because even if they just want to look at it financially, by the time you get somebody that's like a full functioning officer, they're 5 or 6 years into the job. You've paid them hundreds of thousands of dollars. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on training equipment. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on benefits and experience in these things that, like, we'd use the thing. Well, somebody, what was that like? Well, can you tell me what chocolate tastes like? I can't teach you that. You have to be there. So there's a whole lot of that in, military related jobs. There's a lot of that in first responder jobs. There's a lot of that in jobs where you deal with other human and certain various crises in different phases, where you just had to experience it. But now that's in your portfolio. You know how to handle that in theory. Where you bring on somebody new, they can have been great in college. They could have been really good in the military. They could have done great in the academy, but they still don't have that experience, right? So
It's different
it's a much bigger problem than people understand it to be in most cases, I think, anyway, for sure.
For sure. I mean, regardless of, I said the police thing is, there's obviously a division going on, because it seems like the bad cops are being highlighted a lot more.
Yeah.
Right. So now there's this perception developing, and, obviously there's truths to that those truths exist, but regardless of that, there's not really a good community that really supports that in a way that, anyone can go and just kind of talk about it. And like you said, not have to carry those things with you to where, now you've got it's like you're churning out people that are broken. Right. And not
sure.
you, right. And this happens obviously with the military in any role, right.
Yeah.
Where there's things that people are job duties or jobs or roles that people are exposed to very traumatic things. And the systems we have set up, it's just like we're producing more and more injured people. And it's like, well, we don't want to throw more money at it. It's kind of this default answer where it's like, well, that's actually costing you more.
It sure is. Yeah.
Right. So you're getting less quality. So it costs you more for a poorer performance from the officers, because the guy that, knows all about it for 5 years, or, finally got to a point where he kind of has the tribal knowledge, so to speak, he's now left because we
Yeah.
didn't help train them for that or take care of this aspect of it. So it's interesting when we talk about, like, what is a good solution for this? It's like, well, it's going to be some massive changes on, a societal scale, so to speak. But, like you said, that we could start moving that direction by
Yes.
immediately after action, right?
Yeah.
Let's get out of the cars and let's go debrief.
Yeah,
So we're not
and one of the things I know that hinders the debrief part about it is the reality of the fact that if it's connected to something where there's legal action, whether it's civil action or criminal action, right? Finding a way to make that a confidential conversation that when you inevitably get sued, it's not discoverable, right? Well, what'd you guys talk about? Well, we talked about how we felt. Well, how'd that make you feel, officer? Right? Really fucked up, right? How's that make you feel to ask me a dumbass question, right? Like, it ends up being a road that, we've done a really good job of paving in this country for that part of it too. And people are like, that shouldn't be an issue. Well, it is. It's just the reality of it. It's just the reality. Now you have the world of body cameras, car cameras, all these things, right? And when you take segments of certain things and plug it in to a narrative when you're trying to get to an end that isn't necessarily procedurally just, people are reluctant, so there's that whole thing too. So it isn't just, hey, let's make roll call safe space for a half an hour. Well, okay, well, we're going to back up the fact that those are confidential conversations. And then if they want to know what was said, then make them fight, make an attorney fight to understand what was said there, so there's that aspect of it too, and we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it. There is, there absolutely is. So there is a lot of work to do, but we have to start. And I think that's the best place to start because, I'm sure there are times where you'd go off and you might talk with one other guy that you knew would listen. Okay. But then you're bouncing each other's perspective off of the same thing, but you were probably, especially like in the space of a battlefield, you were probably in close proximity to each other. So your perspective might have been completely different to have somebody else. And like we talked earlier, they saw something you didn't see.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you'd feel better if you understood, well, shit, that was really screwed up. I'm glad we did that, as opposed to, man, I wish we were never even there for that. Like, I just think it's there's a lot of value in it inherently is better than any bad that could come from it, as far as I'm concerned. We just have to protect those people who are protecting us. And like you said, right now, it certainly feels like there isn't communal support for that. And to your point, you're absolutely right. There are bad officers. But when we make that the highlight reel,
right.
Anything
can be demonized if you show it enough times on TV.
Right. Like, I mean, I've had some really terrible dentists in my life. I didn't quit going to the dentist just because I had some bad dentists. I don't think they all suck at, cleaning teeth. You know what I mean? So but I've never seen an all out assault on, banned dentistry, defund dentists, right? You know what I mean? Like, nobody wants anybody in their mouth doing stuff, but that's part of it,
Right.
So it has to be incremental, but I think that the change has to start with the people that are affected by it the most. Because if us, not us, then who, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're the ones qualified to start our own change. So, that's definitely the space to start.
So it is, you made a very good point about how litigious this country is. And I think I found you a loophole, right? So in each police department, one of y'all needs to get your attorney license And then so everybody else can just retain them for
Attorney-client
$1.
privilege.
What's
Yeah.
that?
Attorney-client privilege.
Oh yeah. So then you can just go in a room with your attorney, whoever's best qualified to do the trauma thing. Just
Yeah.
pay him $1 and that's it. That's it. No conversation can come
No,
out.
and it's funny, you laugh about that, but that's one of the things a lot of people understand. The amount of cops that work the street that are licensed to practice law is astounding. Like I can think of over the course of the years, 10 that I knew in other departments. One that worked was a supervisor in the department that I worked in when I first got hired. One I know now, I'm really good friends. It was with a neighboring department. He's a lieutenant in that department, and he went to law school at night, and he passed the bar exam on the first round. Because initially at that point he thought he wanted to go in the FBI, but then he smartened up and just stayed where he was at, and can help his community directly. So he might be on to something.
Go charge a $1 retainer fee and help your friends.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's pretty funny, but yeah. And we've talked about that too, that doesn't help either, is that the sort of
consequences that await you if you screw up in any way, shape or
form, because like the reality of what you swore to do, sometimes it is de-administrated to the point where what I think I'm supposed to be doing, I swore to do, I'm not remotely allowed to do. I had a conversation probably a month ago with somebody else that used to be a police officer and had left for that reason. And two of the people that were with them on a particular incident doing police work are going to trial for murder just because of they were doing their job, right? So that's the reason this person was like, I am not doing this anymore. I'm not being part of this, for that particular place. So that's the reality, and it makes it hard. And as a result, I think you're going to start to see people getting involved in these careers that don't have the requisite character to carry out the duty. So all that does is feed into the perception of, what people are already told they should perceive. Right. If you have morals, you have integrity, and you go somewhere where you're not allowed to engage in that, you either have to watch things bad happen and you're not allowed to act, or you're asked to go and serve warrants or do things that violate criminal procedure just because it fits an agenda. You're only going to get certain people to do that, and in most of the cases, they're not going to be warriors. They're not going to be the warrior guardian, right? So that's another conversation down the road, but it's all, to me, tied together in the fact that why we need to take care of the people that really care, because you're not going to have as adverse actions to things if you don't have the right process and care about other humans. You just aren't, Well,
sure. And if you sit here and advertise like, again, highlight reel of bad cops, that's like, here's all these, quote unquote bad cops doing quote unquote bad things. That's like advertisement for, someone who then may not be of high moral character, is like, well, shit, I should just go get that job. It seems like I can do whatever I want. And the good guys are like, yo, this is a witch hunt. Like, I don't want to be a part of this, or there's not that support, and they're getting traumatized, or, whatever it may be. So now it's like you're producing the thing we're trying to get rid of, or the thing we know we need to go away. And that's, we can go on, like you said, we can go on with that for a while, but the reality is bad people exist everywhere. But the systems we employ and how we view our first responders, police, firefighters, it's not healthy, and it's producing us by us attacking it. It's giving us more of what we're saying we don't want.
No, for sure. And when we have to head down a different road, or as an entire country, we're going to pay for this grievously. And anecdotally, it sure seems like we are already. I'd be interested to see numbers, true objective numbers, attrition rates from even when I retired in 2018 till just, 4 years later.
Sure.
I'm sure it's a world of difference. I'm certain it's a world of difference, So that in itself is then that begs you to ask powerful questions. Why is this happening? And it's all over the country. It isn't just one place where you can be, well, that's just a crappy place to work or whatever. It's happening all over the country.
Yeah, I would think for as much as we highlight it in media, right? Obviously, this has changes. This does things to us. There are well, maybe not a million, but there are many studies you can find that talk about the effects of television, different colors that are used, different frequencies of noise, all these different things that when you're watching something, you're engaging in some sort of programming. That's why it's called programming, because those programs actually make you feel a certain way, think a certain way.
Yeah.
You watch Friends and you get the all happy feeling and laughing and crying and sad and up and down. But that can also instill ideas or ways of thinking. And so you're right. The fact that we're blasting it everywhere in places that it otherwise didn't exist. So this was fascinating for me. I grew up in California where, affirmative action was kind of still a thing when I was younger. But I remember that it polarized people, regardless of if you were, racist or not racist, or it didn't matter, right? Obviously it did exist. Obviously there was discrimination, but when affirmative action came about, it's like, okay, well, now we're going to legislate things to be fair. Well, all that did actually in reality was polarize people who otherwise were not.
Yeah.
So you had some people like, we got to rise up and make this fair. But then you also increased the number of people that were like, this is garbage. And now I hate that person because that person passed a law. And it's, well, we just need to stop kind of all that, right? How do we get from us, instead of attacking things and bringing it up, because now it's rampant everywhere, just start that societal change, I guess just change what we're exposing ourselves to, right? Get people to watch more podcasts like this. Haha, plug. Anyway.
No, for sure. No, I'm a big believer in, you end up being a product of what you're informed by and what you choose to believe.
Yes.
Just as much as you're a product of your own habits. Well, if your habit is to watch a particular news program, and maybe it's just because it supports what you want to believe, and you never check to see, regardless of where you're at in any spectrum, whether that information is remotely correct, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're doing the country a disservice, right? And if you can't care about self or country, well, then you have a whole lot of work to do. And you probably don't understand why you exist if those two things don't matter. So, that's a big piece of it. And that, again, that's one of those things that we could have a whole completely different conversation on that. But I think that the progress, as far as what we're talking about with the PTSD, is definitely better communal understanding of why people engage in these duty related jobs, understanding that they need to be supported, that, being able to be stronger from being exposed to vulnerabilities is actually what makes you a stronger person each time that happens. And that they're not broken because somebody chose to throw a label on them. They've just been exposed to things that you probably weren't, an understanding of that without pity is really important. And then that piece of being able to support each other in real time on sorting out what we just saw, why we think it happened, what we can learn from it moving forward, and is there anything in the aftermath to prevent it, right? Because a lot of times within communities, there's communal structure that just supports dumb shit happening over and over again. So when you go in and you build community to either no longer tolerate something, or, you prevent criminal activity through environmental design, which is a whole other thing, you can change outcomes. I've been part of it for years and years and years, but you can also destroy outcomes by doing the opposite. So, those are all things that need to be considered if we're going to talk about being better on what happens with people that are exposed to traumatic shit moving forward, prior and after, and even during, right?
Yep. That's an interesting point you made about the and also we've talked about this a few times with how communities should always police their own, right? Like we all know what's right. We all should speak up, and that's not meant to sit there and necessarily chastise someone or beat someone down, because we don't want to do that. We want to make everyone better, right? And we do that through making sure that we're all kind of keeping ourselves in check. We are coming up on time. So I did want to ask, what's next from Robert Greenaway? Tell me a little bit about Set the Path.
Well, what's next is I am going to be putting together a couple digital courses. I'm working with somebody that, ironically, from the Den, not ironically, that's how I met them. And they are in the process of redoing my logo, revamping my website. They're going to help me launch digital courses. So that's exciting to me, because I want to be able to give as much value to people. Like, to me, the people receiving the message I have on how to be more self-aware, how to prevent crime for their families, and how to be able to transition from duty positions to civilian work successfully, right? To heal from PTSD, to understand that that's part of who you are, take that and turn that into things we've talked about during this whole hour, and galvanize that to become a civilian that, is able to aim at what they desire. And that, to me, is going to be through a coaching group, right? So it's important to me to get these digital courses out first, and then I'll work on the coaching group, because the space I want to be in is going to be organic. It's not salesy. That's not who I am. It's not about the income. It's about the outcome. And I truly, from deep in my heart, that's what I desire to do. I believe that is my purpose, because that's what my purpose was the entire time I was a police officer. I just looked at it as part of my job, but my purpose the entire time was to make people feel better about what they did and to build better communities, right? And to me, it's just an extension of that. So that's what's next. And I'm really looking forward to that chapter, and I'm excited about it. And I'm excited about the challenges. So that's where I'm at with that.
That actually does sound very exciting. And I didn't know some of that, so that's cool to hear.
Yeah.
Oh man, there's so much I could go on about.
We'll just have to talk again. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably talk for a while after this, but we'll have to have you on again, because I feel like there's a lot we could continue to go on about.
For sure.
Thanks so much for being on today. For anyone else, thank you for listening. Like, subscribe. Hope you liked what you heard. If not, that's okay. You can leave nasty comments too. Those are always fun to read. And join us next time. Until then, have a great week, everyone.
Hey, thanks for having me.